We now move on to our first panel discussion about are all systems go for hydrogen and delivering 10 gigawatts by 2030. And I'm very pleased to welcome Clare Jackson from Hydrogen UK, who is going to host that session and introduce her panel. Clare.
Brilliant. Well, I'd like to invite my panel up, wherever they might be. Brilliant. Yes, so we've got a fantastic sort of panel session to kick us off this morning. All systems go for hydrogen. Very, very exciting. Wonderful to be here. When I was a kid, the Science Museum was always my absolute favourite place. Whenever it was my turn to choose where it was we got to go as a family, I always picked the Science Museum. So it's fantastic to be here at Hydrogen for Life. It's the second year we've been here, so really, really excited to be here. And fantastic panel discussion that we've got today. I'm going to ask my panellists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to have a sort of discussion. There is an app. If you haven't downloaded it yet, please download the app where you can ask all of your questions, and they'll sort of pop up on the screen for me so I can ask the panelists your questions, which will be much more interesting than my questions. And then we'll also have the sort of roaming mic that we've had if you can't manage to get the app to download or work. So yeah, we've got a great session coming up, and I'll just sort of start by asking my panellists to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name's Katie Ostheimer. I'm from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. I work in the Hydrogen Directorate. There's a number of deputy directors. I feel like everyone else works on production and I do everything else. So I do transport and storage strategy and policy, the transport business model, end uses for hydrogen, non-economic, economic regulation and blending. So that's me.
Amazing. Thanks, Katie.
Rachael Glaving, so I'm the Commercial Director for EDF UK Generation. So that's, I'm a nuclear representative, nuclear part of the business. I did actually want to say, we wouldn't even have nuclear power generation in this country without hydrogen as well. It's an input into that. But I'm also representing other activities in EDF. So that's EDF Hynamics, which is our hydrogen company. And of course representing the renewables business as well. So we have, we're the largest producer of low carbon power in the UK and lots of ambition around hydrogen production and operation.
Amazing, thanks.
Hi everyone, my name's Simon Webb. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Warwick Manufacturing Group, which is one of the high value manufacturing catapult centres and part of the University of Warwick. My background is more around aerospace and aviation. So I worked 20 years with Rolls-Royce. And towards the end of the time there, I was seconded out to the Aerospace Technology Institute. And I was the chief engineer on the Fly Zero study activity, which really got my enthusiasm and knowledge for hydrogen because we down selected to the use of liquid hydrogen for future zero emission flight.
Amazing. So, right, the sort of title of our panel, how will we deliver 10 gigawatts by 2030? 10 gigawatts, it's a pretty big number. I sort of noted the recent Committee on Climate Change's study on decarbonising the power sector said by 2030 we're going to need between 9 and 14 gigawatts of hydrogen. So we're probably at 10 gigawatts is towards the lower end, but still a monumental challenge to get there from what is effectively pretty close to zero. So perhaps if we sort of start with Katie. What's the government doing? How are we going to get to that 10 gigawatts?
So, how are we going to get there? I think the first thing we absolutely must do is deliver on this first wave of projects and the first wave of allocation rounds that are coming forward. So we've already allocated through the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund the first 2 strands. We've shortlisted the CCUS Track 1 cluster in the hydrogen allocation round. And I think one of the best things we can do, government and industry together, is build confidence by delivering those projects on the ground successfully. Yeah. So I think the partnership in making those initial projects a success is obviously something that we're all very focused on. And then the next thing is absolutely looking to the future. So we've committed to do a production roadmap at the end of this year. That was in response to Chris Skidmore's review. And that's all about how do we go from these early stage projects to scale up. And we really welcome engagement with industry over the course of this year to map that route out. And to sit alongside that, we're going to be setting out our approach to strategic planning for transport and storage. So we need to make sure, as I said before, we complete this value chain. So it's not just scaling up production, it's everything else that has to go with it. We have to do the end-to-end, and transport and storage is absolutely key. I think one of the main things we're focused on is making sure we facilitate a mature market. So we need that regulation in place to give confidence that the market's going to function. So things like the low carbon hydrogen standard, the certification standard, what we're doing on non-economic regulation, make sure the regulators are scaled up and ready to take on this challenge. Just gives people confidence in the planning system as well, give people confidence that the sector's going to grow. And I think, as I mentioned, completing the value chain, we obviously need to focus and support the end use cases as well. We've got a wide suite of things we're doing across hydrogen to power. As you probably know, we're consulting on that later this year. We have a wide range of innovation funds to bring forward end use cases. So I think it's all of that.
Yeah.
All of that and probably more.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's often the case that we just think it's about getting big production projects down. But the reality is that's a huge part of it. But there's this whole ecosystem that needs to go around it. And sometimes it's some of the softer things as well, which have a sort of big impact in these things coming forward or not coming forwards. Things like planning and things that we don't necessarily always think about that we need to get right. And Rachel, when we talk about those big sort of production things, I thought you said sort of hydrogen is absolutely essential for nuclear. Nuclear is absolutely essential for hydrogen as well. I was slightly disappointed Angie didn't have a small modular reactor in her bag as well. But talk to us a little bit about the role the sort of interplay between hydrogen and nuclear.
Yeah, and I was actually going to say I usually carry a piece of uranium dioxide in my handbag that I could have pulled out at this very moment.
What a shame.
But yeah, don't have it on me. So the topic of nuclear backed hydrogen is a really interesting one, and one that probably doesn't get talked about that much. I do think, this jump from demonstration, relatively low load factor projects to mass production, at scale production, I think can really be unlocked by nuclear power. We've got this unique nuclear fleet in the UK. We made a design choice back in the 60s that set us on a path of having a type of nuclear power reactor that many other places don't have. And the byproduct of that decision is that our power stations produce very, very high temperature heat, much higher than the average, so 600 degrees as opposed to 250-ish, for, let's say, normal power stations. And that just unlocks a huge opportunity because we have a fleet in the UK that's coming to an end of its life. So we've got this brilliant opportunity to demonstrate the use of heat from our power stations, as well as continuing to produce power, to take that heat and use it for heat-assisted hydrogen production. And when we can demonstrate that and do that at scale, what we end up with is an always-on, very efficient, highly effective process for producing hydrogen that actually has another kind of unintended consequence of bringing a degree of flexibility to nuclear power generation that doesn't exist today. So I think there's like this double benefit. You have a huge energy security angle, a huge flexibility angle, but more importantly, it's at scale production. And personally, I think that could be really useful in achieving 10 gigawatts.
And what sort of timescales are those sort of demonstrators working to? How quickly could we deliver some of that?
Yeah, so we're in a little bit of a race against the clock because we have a demonstration project that we're working on where we want to demonstrate this at one of our power stations, but 7 of the 8 existing power stations in the UK will close before the end of the decade. Okay. So we want to demonstrate, within the next 3 years, the production of hydrogen at one of our power stations, recognising that that's not necessarily going to be the end solution, but if we can demonstrate with what we have today and the technology that we have today, then actually that can unlock, as you mentioned, small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, these other much smaller technologies that are coming along in the future means that the step for them to take to produce hydrogen could be just that smaller because we've started today with what we have.
Yeah, amazing. And then Simon, what's the sort of role of innovation in all of this? Like, what's the sort of catapults doing? How is this sort of wider ecosystem playing into the sort of hydrogen production targets?
Yeah, so I think that is the third leg to me. So I think the other panelists have talked about creating the market pull, so creating more certainty for investors to come in, and then the supply side as well, to make sure we have the necessary infrastructure to be able to supply the hydrogen as and when it's needed through the pilots and through the scale-up. But I think that third leg is around the research, the knowledge, the technology, and the innovation. And that's where the RTOs, the research organisations, universities, and the catapults can play a part in working with industry to have the necessary capability, infrastructure up front, ready for when that technology deployment is required and the investment in the scale-up is required as well. Particularly around the applications. So I personally have been heavily involved in transportation, in the past in aerospace and aviation, and now more so in road-based transportation. And I think hydrogen will certainly have its part to play there, and the technology needs to be ready. Hydrogen is not necessarily an easy molecule to deal with. It has many differences compared to what we're used to. We're used to digging energy out of the ground. It's a relatively stable fuel set we have across the transportation sectors. There's going to need to be quite a step change in the research, the knowledge base, the skills and the technology that goes with that going forward. And I'm not sure that there was a comment earlier that we think we're ahead in the UK on hydrogen. I'm not sure that's the case today across all of these three legs. I think we have a good plan going forward, but I think there's a lot to do, and I think it will be necessary to do a lot of pump priming up front to get ready for this technology activity and then the scale up. So in particular, I think what we need to do to enable that innovation skills and technology is have the test infrastructure ready up front before the pull comes from the market, so that we can do this demonstration activity right down at fundamental level with materials, building up to components, and then full system demonstrators as well. And that's not trivial to get the infrastructure, the test infrastructure ready to deal with hydrogen, because there's many different new novel challenges we'll be faced with, and we need the skills and capabilities to be able to do that activity.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting people talk about the global leader in hydrogen. You know, hydrogen is many different things, many different technologies, many different kinds of different projects. And the reality is there's not going to be a single global leader in hydrogen. I'm interested in your thoughts as to which areas of the hydrogen value chain the UK could be a global leader or is already further ahead, and where we should be sort of doubling down.
So, maybe I'm slightly biased, but my background's in aerospace and aviation, and the UK does today have a strong position around some key technologies and subsystems around aerospace. So particularly my background with Rolls-Royce, so the gas turbine engine and the whole propulsion system that goes with that. Then Airbus have a strong position in the UK around fuel systems and wings as well. All three of those will go through a significant change in a new hydrogen-powered aircraft. And Airbus is pushing strongly, and Rolls-Royce as well, are putting money and demonstrating activity into these areas. So I think we need to get ready for that change. We're working strongly with universities, catapults, and into industry to try and make that happen. In my previous role, working with the ATI, I was head of zero carbon strategy. And we pushed forward a proposal to do a hydrogen capability network. And there's a planning activity going on now to look at getting a case for investment, to invest in the UK, coordinating capabilities that already exist, modifying and building on those capabilities, and where necessary, investing in new capabilities, new test infrastructure. I think that is an area where the UK could play a strong part going forward. There's a lot to do. Particularly, I would say, on the left side of the supply chain there, the providing the liquid hydrogen, that has been a significant issue for big companies like Airbus and Rolls-Royce, but right down into their supply chain as well. Just securing that liquid hydrogen for the pilot activity, so small scale supply of liquid hydrogen, is incredibly hard. And if Airbus and Rolls-Royce are struggling to do that, then the supply chain must be finding it really hard. So that's one key enabler. The test infrastructure is another, and then the skills and knowledge to go with that, which does need a lot of development. So I think all three of those areas need to be developed for aviation. I do see from a wider context, speaking to some of the big suppliers of hydrogen production equipment and the liquefaction equipment, liquid hydrogen could play a part as a regional energy vector as well. It's more compact than gaseous hydrogen. You don't need a heavy, thick pressure vessel wrapped around it necessarily. You need to deal with the thermal issues more. But transporting energy around the country and around regions, if hydrogen is the end use case, liquid hydrogen could have a significant use in being a regional energy vector as well.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, I think this is a key thing, isn't it? We don't just want to be a global leader in the deployment of hydrogen. We want to be a global leader in the development and manufacture of hydrogen as well. This is where a lot of the economic value comes in. This is where a lot of the jobs come in. I don't know, Katie, what your thoughts are on how industry and government could be working better together to ensure that we capture that economic value associated with hydrogen alongside the decarbonisation.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lord Offord of Garville mentioned a couple of things about where industry can really come forward with the R&D and being a vocal voice, and I think that has a huge impact. I think in where we can work together, there are a couple of things we've done over the last year which I think are quite helpful focal points for that. One is our investor roadmap, where government is trying to communicate really clearly our level of ambition and what we see the opportunities are, all the way from production through transport and storage to end use, and that's meant to be a route for industry to see the opportunity and have access to it and engage with government on that opportunity. So we want to keep evolving that. We really welcome feedback on that and engagement with that. And I think the other main thing to mention would be the sector development action plan that we're working together with industry and will ultimately be industry owned. But that's really trying to drive forward progress on things like the supply chain, on jobs and skills, and on trade on export as well. So we're going to be working that up over the course of this year, and I think giving lots of energy to that jointly and really owning it and driving it, I think will have a big impact.
Yeah, amazing. One of the things that sort of Angie touched on in her opening wonderful speech was around this importance of looking at things from a whole system perspective and not sort of, siloing hydrogen over here and electrification over here, and actually looking at how these things are working together. And obviously, nuclear is one of those spaces where you have that intersection between power and gas. I'm just interested in your thoughts, Rachael, on how we can be doing better as an industry in terms of making sure that we're not siloed in the way that we're thinking about the energy transition.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because we are at a point now where it's no longer appropriate to think of technologies independently. I think for quite a long time we have done that in the UK, and it's been okay. Big push on wind generation, off you go. Big push on batteries, fine. Solar, nuclear, and these industries have tended to be rather separate targets, separate approaches, separate funding mechanisms. And I think we're entering this phase now, and especially, sparked on by the energy sovereignty question, the energy security question. And then when you throw hydrogen into the mix now as well, what you end up with is an answer, the best answer for all of these individual technologies is an answer that incorporates all of the technologies. This integration of our energy supply and energy storage system is absolutely necessary, and it's not just necessary on the technology level. It's the grid as well. It's the local level, it's the national level, and that's a new thing for us. It also brings in the question of opening up additional opportunities for investment, for holistic policy making, and then even tying it back, to the levy. It means that you could we should end up in a position where we're not thinking about what's the answer for hydrogen, what's the cost for hydrogen, what's the levy we need to pay for hydrogen, but instead, what is the cost and the best method and the direction to get to net zero, and what's the best way to balance that holistically.
Whilst we're talking about the levy,
yeah.
Just interested in the panelists' views on the importance of the legislation that's sitting within the energy bill at the moment, and the impact that will have on the industry. Just interested in, I'm going to open that up, interested in thoughts on that.
Well, I think that first pillar of providing a level of certainty going forward for investment so that companies can take a case to their board for what will need to be significant investment right from the production of hydrogen, liquefaction if necessary, the use cases of technologies which require substantial demonstration activity. The government signalling that there could be commitment to hydrogen both in terms of use in power generation and then application, contract for difference and levies, and the flip side of that, providing more certainty on carbon taxation over time as well. So the carrot and the stick. I think that will really help CFOs sign off substantial business case investments around hydrogen and give them some confidence they're not going to have stranded assets in 20, 30 years' time that could be billions of pounds, those assets.
I would completely agree with that as well. The bill contains critical provisions really to kickstart and develop further hydrogen production in the UK and to embed the low carbon hydrogen standard and its application and the hydrogen business model, all will be enabled by the passing of the bill. So for me, it's critical, but also to your point, what's it really necessary for? It's building confidence, investor confidence, industry confidence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. We're really keen to ensure that the bill provides a reliable and robust funding mechanism for hydrogen. That's obviously the intention and our hope. And we just yesterday introduced further amendments on transport and storage to facilitate those business models as well. So we really want it to be comprehensive and robust for the sector and to provide that confidence.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise how far we have come in the last few years, and they're actually on the brink of something really special here in the UK. There's been a lot of work that's gone into what is now a sort of pipeline of some of the most mature projects anywhere in the world that are sitting there ready to go. And alongside that, there's also been a huge amount of work that's gone on with Katie and her department on the development of what is, in all honesty, a world-leading hydrogen production support policy. There are other countries around the world that are looking to the UK and going, that is a cracking bit of policy. Perhaps not quite with that language. But we have all the components that are sitting there ready on the table to deliver what will be a sort of world-leading hydrogen ecosystem here in the UK. But none of that happens unless we have the funding mechanism to get these projects off the ground. All of the building blocks are there, they're all ready to go, but we now just actually need to hit that go button and that energy bill needs to get passed. Sorry, it's one of my sort of like key things at the moment, so you'll have to forgive me. I know I'm not really supposed to go on as the chairing the session. But I'm interested also in things that we might be able to learn from our neighbours in Europe or perhaps sort of further afield around the world. I'm interested, Katie, in what sort of, what's the government doing in terms of talking to its sort of counterparts elsewhere, and what are you guys learning from what's happening around the world?
Absolutely. Lots. We're all learning together, as you said. This is a big global effort, and the more success we see elsewhere and growth of hydrogen economies elsewhere is only helpful for the UK because it grows the market for hydrogen and it enables us to reach scale quicker, bring down cost. We're doing lots of engagement, we're doing lots of bilateral engagement. So we have MOUs with Belgium and Norway. We have an energy partnership with the US. Also mentioned before was lots of engagement we're having with Germany, and we really look forward to formalising that partnership as well. And we also have lots of engagement through the more formal multilateral systems as well. So clean energy ministerial meetings, breakthrough agenda that came out of COP last year. I'm forgetting an important one, but a range of things like that. I'll find my list and finish it. But I think we're really heavily engaged because we know that we are all learning together and we've got such a lot to benefit from each other. And it is a race in that we want to see investment in the UK, and we are very, very committed to staying at the front of the policy agenda. And stakeholders feedback to us at the moment that the state of the policy and the policy framework in the UK is very competitive and it is mature. We now have the published low carbon hydrogen agreement, which is a really exciting step. So it really reflects the success we had on the renewables agenda as well. So yeah, lots of engagement, lots of learning, and we're keen to see success everywhere.
Obviously, EDF not just operating in the UK. How are you guys sort of learning from elsewhere in the world? Yeah,
so through Hynamics we have a number of projects. I think it's about 60 projects in total, 1 gigawatt of hydrogen projects in development. And a key part of that is collaboration and with different countries. So there's a lot going on in Germany, a lot going on in France, operational plants there. And it's interesting to see, how different countries are approaching the sort of acceleration of these early development projects with the different policies and incentive mechanisms that they have. So Germany is really interesting what's happening there. There's a lot of positive work going on the policy side, but I've got to say, we are also finding that we are being asked quite a lot. They are coming to us as well, especially around things like hydrogen blending and gas networks, and some of the early activities we have around solid oxide and heat-assisted hydrogen production. We're actually also bringing them here to see what we're doing. So I think we've got a lot to learn from them, but also, I think we are teaching as well.
Amazing. Any thoughts on that, Simon?
Yeah, so I guess my thoughts are around that balance between collaboration and competition. From one view, you could say this is it's a global problem and there needs to be a global solution. And as you said, there's economies of scale to be had across the globe. I think other countries, in many instances, in terms of that scale of investment that already exists, are ahead of us today in terms of the plants to produce hydrogen. So I think there needs to be a ramp up there. I think the UK needs to find the right places to lead and play. And that's not necessarily everywhere in the overall hydrogen ecosystem. But there needs to be enough to have a critical mass of activity that we can link up through those different pillars of supply, technology, and application and use. So we need to find the right places to play and then find where we're going to collaborate, where we're going to lead, and where we're going to let others lead as well.
Yeah, in many ways I think it's quite sad that we're seeing a little bit at the moment sort of international governments being a little bit more protectionist in their approach to energy in general, but I guess also hydrogen gets caught up in that. I think it's important that as industry we continue to collaborate as much as we possibly can across borders. An awful lot to learn from others, triumphs and mistakes. Wonderful. We've got some questions that have come through on the screen, which is very, very exciting. So I'm going to sort of run through these and then we'll sort of open up to the floor for anyone who hasn't managed to make the technology work, and we'll do things the old school way. So interested in thoughts on what role will hydrogen internal combustion engines play in helping UK transport on the journey to net zero? I think maybe that's a question for Simon.
Yeah, thank you. So what role will it play? So I think across different sectors there's different answers there. And if I take this to be wider hydrogen combustion, start with what I'm familiar with in the recent past in aerospace and aviation, I think hydrogen into gas turbine engines could play a significant part in the future. It is efficient. You can use much of the technology you have today in the gas turbine engine. And there are certain advantages of using it. There are significant challenges from a technology point of view, particularly for using liquid hydrogen, which is probably required as you get to bigger, longer range aircraft. So around storage, pumping and the combustion system. But it's zero carbon fuel, and that can have a significant advantage in the cycle as well, because you can cool the gas turbine. So I think there's a big place to play there. Airbus, Rolls-Royce, many others are pushing that forward now. It still needs the test infrastructure and the supply of the liquid hydrogen to enable that to happen. Ground-based transportation, and full disclosure here, Warwick Manufacturing Group, there's a lot of work on batteries and electrical systems. I think for mass consumer, smaller cars and smaller vans, I think that my view is the battle is over really, between battery electric vehicles and fuel cell hydrogen vehicles. I know other countries have a bigger network and infrastructure for refueling with hydrogen, but overall I think it's more energy efficient to use battery electric vehicles, and the infrastructure is virtually there. There's a way to go as the uptake comes, but I think that's the right solution and I think it's winning. I think where it can play a part and will play a part, hydrogen, is in real heavy duty vehicles, so heavy goods vehicles and special kind of high load vehicles in mines, for example. So that's where hydrogen can play a part, I think, in the future. And it's a relatively, technology-wise, it's a relatively small step to be able to put hydrogen into reciprocating internal combustion engines as well. So I think it will play a part there, and I think there's some technology work needed and there's a level of infrastructure to go with that, but it could play a big part in heavy-duty vehicles.
I think that's absolutely right, Simon. One thing I would say is I think consumer choice is incredibly important, and the more choices we can give people when they're looking to decarbonise, the better. And even if the spreadsheet might say battery electrics are best for cars, which I think is probably absolutely right, there still might be some people who would prefer a hydrogen option. Energy efficiency is not the only reason people choose different cars, I guess. I'm interested, while we're on the transport, this isn't one on the screen, but there was a question earlier about perhaps the difference in standards within the sort of low carbon hydrogen standard and some of the standards that are required on the sort of transport side of things, which obviously makes it a little bit difficult for production projects, particularly ones that want to use that hydrogen in multiple different applications. If you've got one standard here and one standard there, that's quite difficult. I'm interested in your thoughts, Katie, on how DFT and DESNZ are sort of coordinating to try and make that regulatory aspect a little bit easier for industry.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this is not something that I...
Okay.
You're putting me a bit on the spot.
We'll find someone at some point who can answer that question.
But
I would...
yeah, I'll just say a very quick thing, which is we're absolutely working extremely closely together. There is the strategic objectives of scaling up hydrogen production are slightly different to the zero-emission tailpipe objectives, and I think it's bringing those together over time, which is what we will be doing between the departments, absolutely. There is access to RTFO for hydrogen projects. That's very important. But yeah, I'll hand over. I'll get into the technical differences of exactly what's required by each.
No, yeah, I'm not going into the technical at all. But what I would say is, parochially, on the nuclear side, of course, we have nuclear within the low carbon hydrogen standard through DESNZ, and then in the Department for Transport, it's nuclear would be out. And so, for us trying to get nuclear-backed hydrogen projects underway, it's a difficult situation to be in. And then, when you look, then rules around additionality and the renewable transport fuel obligation, it's kind of a barrier, I guess. For me, it's a barrier to getting projects underway with what we have today, compared to having new assets, and for me, in particular, if we can demonstrate hydrogen production from what we have today, it sort of eases the path in the future. Yeah. So there's something for me, and I really get the debate, because I see the other side, which is, if you've got an existing asset doing something already, you don't want to divert that to hydrogen. It's better to create a brand new asset, focused on hydrogen production, but particularly on the nuclear side, there will be a real advantage in demonstrating with the assets we have today what could be possible in the future. So it's not the answer, but it's
that's slightly more long-term thinking required sometimes rather than the short-term.
Yeah.
So the public. How do we educate the public about hydrogen and its benefits? Do the public have any idea what hydrogen is at the moment? What's that sort of journey that we need to go on? I don't know who wants to kick us off on that one.
Can start?
Yes.
Obviously we have a Secretary of State that is very, very, very focused on engaging with the public and communicating the benefits. And I think a lot of that is about the end use cases. So it's really making it real for people and what's the benefit that we will see. And I think industry has an incredibly important part to play in that. So for big parts of industry, whether you're looking at sort of chemicals or ceramics, keeping British industry in the UK, hydrogen is their lead option for decarbonising. So I think with communicating to the public the benefit to the economy and the benefit to brands that mean a lot to us and we want to keep on shore, I think that's a big part of it. I think a big part of it is about safety. You need to be communicating the safety case. Obviously, hydrogen has been used for a very long time, very safely. And I think that's a part of it where we get the sense that people have concerns. And I think it's just a big part of it is about hydrogen's contribution to net zero, and it is about the system, isn't it? And I think the role that hydrogen plays in energy security is so important, and that's a big part of the communication going out from the department at the moment. So I'm sure there's lots more to it, but those few things I'd start with.
Yeah, I know, I completely agree with that. We talk about hydrogen as a new technology, a thing for the future, when actually, it's present, as we saw earlier, in many of the things that we have today. There is for me, there's like a compelling story that brings everything together when you look from a systems perspective, because, hydrogen will do way more than just what hydrogen can do. So there's a narrative that can be used more with the public, I think, that says, by having hydrogen, we're also unlocking the possibility of more renewable generation than we would otherwise be able to have. We're able to capitalise more on the incredible wind resource that we have, that we could tap into even greater in this country. So for me, there's two things: that the end use of hydrogen itself, but then what can hydrogen unlock in its energy storage potential. And I think I don't see that much in the public dialogue around that, but I agree. Industry, no, yeah, because they're especially those high temperature industrial processes and manufacturing. They're looking at their business plans for the next decade, 2 decades, and they're saying we need another answer. What is it that's going to decarbonise our industries? So they're ready. They want to talk. They want to demonstrate. But there's still a big gap on the public side, I think.
I think that's right. There's a bit of an opportunity at the moment. I think energy is more at the front of public consciousness than it's been in a very, very long time, given the sort of events of the last sort of 18 months. And so there is a little bit of a window of opportunity to start to talk to people about energy in a way which, we have to speak a different language to perhaps the one that we would speak within the industry. But I think it's about making it real to people about the difference that it will make in their lives in terms of more jobs, the lights staying on, continuing to be able to drink your gin and tonics out of glass containers. It's about trying to make these kinds of things real to people. I'm going to sort of pause there and see if we can have some sort of questions from the floor. If you've got a question, if you just whack your hand up really high, and then the sort of roaming mic can come to you and, oh, there we go, lit you up as well, all of your beautiful faces. Any questions from the floor? I don't believe there's none out there. There we go, we've got one at the far back right there, or left, depending on which way you're facing.
Thank you. Hi, Kerry Mullen from Hynamics again. I just wondered what the panel's view were on the importance of deliverability and experience when we're looking at new projects and getting this sort of moving the dial forward on hydrogen production.
Brilliant, Kate. I know deliverability is hugely important to the department.
Yeah, it's an easy question. It's exceptionally important. I think we've got our short-term targets of delivering the 2 gigawatts in 2025. We're going to have to move incredibly quickly. So projects coming forward that are of really good quality, that are ready to go, is really important for government and industry in working together to get this done. And I think having the skills ready to go with deliverable projects is just it's absolutely what we need. Totally agree.
Any other sort of thoughts on that?
I feel like, as another fellow EDF colleague, I can just add a tiny bit to it, which is, the experience angle, the operations, maintenance, the learning by doing. I think that's what's really, really valuable at the moment. There are loads of developers out there. There are loads of potential projects, but there's quite a wide range between those that are really credible and those that are kind of a bit more on the speculative end of the spectrum. So for me, there's a public acceptance angle as well, because everybody will have confidence in the industry and confidence in our ability to deliver projects if it's backed up with experience and expertise.
The other thing I'd add, sorry if it's the case, is we're obviously very fortunate in the UK in developing the hydrogen economy. We have a vast array of skills that have been developed through oil and gas and other industries that sort of hopefully will set us on quite a successful path. And I think it's one of the things that does give us a real advantage in the UK. So I think that is reflected in the quality of projects that we see.
So just that, I think we need to look hard at the right places and the long lead time items. So when it comes to the pull, we have deliverability ready to go, and we're not waiting a number of years for long lead time infrastructure investments. That might be in plant, in test technology and infrastructure, and also some of the range and depth of skills and knowledge we may need on hydrogen, liquid hydrogen, the materials and technologies that sit with that they aren't going to be switched on instantaneously. So we need to look at those long lead time items and invest up front before the pull comes.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's also where moving quickly is incredibly important as well. If we can get those first projects out first, then that will be hugely important to making sure that we have access to some of those really key elements of the supply chain which are constrained. So yeah, really, really important. And I think as I sort of started off, we've got some absolutely amazing projects in our pipeline that have a far greater maturity. I mean, one of the areas that I would agree with our Secretary of State is one of the reasons the US is having to throw such a lot of money at this is because they don't have the project pipeline that we have in the UK. They would kill for some of the projects that we've got in the UK. But if we don't get them over the line, it doesn't matter. So really important to get them moving. I'm just going to keep harping on about that, but that's okay. Another question? Yes. Sorry, you're going to have to wait for the mic. We like to do it sort of here and there, just to, keep our mic people fit and healthy. Get your steps in.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi, my name is Federico with Bosch in Italy. Can you break down this 10 gigawatt in what are these great projects? Because I'm not familiar with this in the UK. And because I see there are many, or at least important nuclear plants coming online in the UK. Are these already tied to these high temperature processes, or it's still a separate activity? Thank you.
Amazing. Well, Katie, do you want to talk about some of the projects that have been already selected by the government?
Yeah. So the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, which I mentioned earlier, it's funding and allocated quite a lot of green hydrogen projects. And you can see, I'm not going to be able to name them, but you can see online there's a list of successful applicants there. Lots of really fantastic projects right across the country. So there's a very convenient list on gov.uk that will tell you exactly what those projects are and where they are. They're slightly smaller scale and more dispersed to start with, but a really exciting, I think it was 15, I hope I've got that right, 15 projects that were successful. And then we're very focused on the big clusters to start with. So hydrogen and CCUS obviously come together, and the CCUS track 1 cluster is very focused on the northwest and the northeast and around, and the evolution of those projects there are really where we're seeing a lot of development. So, and we also have other big clusters that we're seeing coming forward across the country from Scotland to the southwest. So you'll see in the short list of both the hydrogen allocation round 1 and the CCUS track 1 clusters that were announced in March that were our short list. That's where we're focused, at least initially. But I think it was in the Hydrogen Investor Roadmap, we've seen 20 gigawatts worth of projects come forward, so there's a real scale.
And then I suppose to pick up the nuclear part of the question. So I mentioned before we have a demonstrator project that we're working on up at Heysham Power Station, and that's a project. Yes, it's very small scale. It's 1 megawatt, and the idea is just to demonstrate, the ability to extract steam and actually use it in heat-assisted hydrogen production. So that will do no more than demonstrate that the technology works and that we can make a safety case around it, which is incredibly important when you bring in the question of nuclear, into anything basically. But then, you mentioned the new projects, and that's a particularly interesting angle to look at, because historically nuclear power has been about producing electricity, but we are moving now into this new future. We have a huge number of potential future reactor vendors, circling the UK, all interested in deploying their technologies here, not least because we have a really great regulatory regime that can facilitate development. But what's really notable is that some of those reactor vendors actually have no intention of producing power at all. Some of their technologies are being positioned as producers of heat alone. And then what you could imagine, is that these advanced technologies are producing heat directly into industrial processes, that need heat, or that heat is being used to produce hydrogen in a heat-assisted way. And one kind of really great example of how this could all work together is what's going on at the moment up on Teesside. So we have a nuclear power station in Hartlepool. It's going to close, this within a number of years, certainly this decade, and there's a huge demand locally for high-grade heat, really good quality heat and steam and hydrogen. So there's a lot of hard to decarbonise industries around there. And what that makes is this perfect condition to bring in some of these new nuclear technologies where you could have small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, producing power, yes, but perhaps also producing heat, using that to produce hydrogen. And then what you've got is, because this is such an intense industrial cluster that's used to transporting heat around the locality, there's actually an infrastructure, steam pipework, that's connecting different end users and customers to essentially a heat grid, localized. And that's where it gets interesting, because you could imagine some of those technologies producing heat that has a ready-made infrastructure around it to deploy locally.
Yeah, amazing. I think it's, in terms of some of the breakdown, it's worth saying the only breakdown that's sort of stipulated at the moment is that the government has an ambition that at least half of that 10 gigawatt target will come from electrolytic sources. So that's a sort of, I guess, the breakdown. I think at Hydrogen UK, we've got a sort of database of all of the projects that we're aware of in the UK, and I think it's sort of similar to what Kate said. It comes into just above 20 gigawatts of worth of projects that, in theory, could come forwards by 2030, but then it goes to that sort of piece around deliverability. They're all at slightly different stages of development. Some of them are, pretty much ready to hit the go button, and some of them require a little bit more work before they're able to sort of take FID and actually start building. But yeah, so it'd be really interesting to see what that mix looks like by the time we get to 2030. I feel like there was a question somewhere over there. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Hi, Chris Smith, Meld Energy, an at-scale green hydrogen developer. There's not been a lot of discussion about grid. Mm-hmm. Now, we've seen grid connection applications go in that have come back with 2037. So it's difficult to see how that's going to help us meet the 50% target of electrolytic hydrogen. Of course, we're working with grid, and we'll do what we can to accelerate that. But how does the panel feel or think that we can help to accelerate getting the grid to work to enable projects such as the 100 megawatt project we're developing at Salt End?
Yeah, great question. Grid constraints, thoughts?
First of all, just to really, really agree with the point, how could we have got to this position where the critical path for a net zero energy project ends up being the grid connection? It's absolutely crazy, and I've heard that too. Apply today, connection 2037 potentially. Now the compounding problem with that is, because it's difficult and it takes a lot of time to get a grid connection, it means that there are a huge number of projects that are putting in early applications for grid connections where either there's not really any real intention of deployment, or it's kind of, well, let's get in the queue, let's get our place and see what happens. And so actually that escalates it's exponentially getting worse, the issue. And yeah, it really, really needs addressing. I don't know what the answer is, but I have heard quite a lot of discussion about it's time to actually start prioritising the grid connections that are associated with credible, mature, ready to deliver projects. And that actually might be the right answer from my perspective, but it's an incredibly difficult position. It really is, yeah. And we see it ourselves.
Yeah, solutions on a postcard would be lovely for that one. I think it's one, it's one that we hear all the time around grid constraints. So really, really important. I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts on that. Yes,
Can I
Katie?
just add to that? I mean, obviously, across the board, net zero has thrown the grid and grid connections into the limelight where, 10, 15 years ago, it sort of sat happily in the background. Now it's the centre of everything, whether it's connecting major offshore wind farms offshore onto the shore or connecting projects like this. And I think the government is really seized of the importance of that. I think, hopefully you would have seen, we have Nick Windsor, who's a sort of our grid champion or our sort of networks champion, and there's a lot of thinking going in to how we accelerate that. So I think he's released a report. I hope that's right. So it's worth having a look at that to see what ideas are there. And if you've got things that you think we should be doing that sit outside of what's being already proposed, we really welcome that.
Brill, awesome. We've got lots more questions coming in through the screen. So I think we'll... are you able to flick onto the next? Yeah, that was wonderful. I thought there was an interesting one there for Simon around the benefits of liquid hydrogen in aviation over sustainable aviation fuels, so SAF, or even biofuels. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes. So, firstly, sustainable aviation fuels can be made for a number of different feedstocks, as I'm sure many people are aware. One of which, the power to liquid, uses hydrogen itself. And there's advantages in that. From a technology point of view, it's a relatively minor upgrade to both the ground-based infrastructure and the onboard technology to use sustainable aviation fuels. So it looks attractive to be able to use that in a quicker time frame. Unfortunately, the problem is we've been trying to do that for a while, and we still only produce about 0.1% of the global demand for aviation in sustainable aviation fuels. And that's because it takes more energy and it costs more to make, unfortunately. There are some cheaper feedstocks which come from waste products and then ramping up into biofuels as well, but ultimately they are supply limited. So then you get into the green renewable option of hydrogen with CO2 going through Fischer-Tropsch, and that takes more energy and costs more money ultimately because it takes more energy than using hydrogen. So hydrogen has the challenges of needing the ground-based infrastructure, particularly if you're using liquid hydrogen, you need to be able to deal with the very cold temperatures on the ground and for refueling and all the challenges that go there, and then the onboard technology. That is a significant challenge which will require significant investment to address. But ultimately, hydrogen is very lightweight, which is critical, obviously, for aviation and aerospace. So it's a very energy-dense fuel. And has no carbon in at all. So you're not in necessarily a net zero position. Certainly the point of use, there's a debate to be had always around the mix of the grid you're using to produce the hydrogen, clearly, but that's in any application. So you're putting no CO2 into the atmosphere when you're using it. And I would say, across transport and wider, that one of the biggest issues is that we are addicted to digging energy out of the ground. That's cheap, it gives us a relatively stable fuel. We need to be able to get over that for environmental reasons, for energy reasons, for economic reasons as well going forward, in terms of having the national security of supply of energy and particularly of fuels. So I think SAF has its part to play. And all the aircraft that are flying today are not going to get retired in the next couple of years. Clearly, they're very expensive assets. So it has its part to play in trying to maximise, as quickly as possible, decarbonising the current fleet. But over time, when a new fleet is required, that's when hydrogen, and progressively moving towards liquid hydrogen, will be able to decarbonise that fleet in a better way that's more economic over the life of the aircraft as well.
Amazing. We've got a few minutes left, time for one more question. There was one on there about sort of demand side policies. Are we doing enough on demand side? I wonder, Katie, whether you could talk to us about what the government's currently doing on demand side policies.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to be as comprehensive as possible across all the energy cases. There's obviously lots going on in transport, and I know that's focus. We're sort of accelerating our work on hydrogen to power a lot because we recognise the importance, and that's very much plays into the system element that Rachel was talking about before, and the role of hydrogen there, and people are talking about that a lot more. Committee on Climate Change been talking about that a lot. So we're going to be consulting on that, and we'll be looking at that in a lot of detail this year. And obviously, industrial fuel switching is incredibly important. We have our Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which is a really important fund for us. It's looking at sort of developing and deploying technologies for fuel switching. And obviously we have lots going on with heat as well, as people will be familiar with. So we really want to be comprehensive across the board and making sure that we're supporting all sorts of technologies to come forward from the sort of the R&D really early stage through to deployment.
Any thoughts from our other panellists on where we need some more demand side intervention?
Not my topic area.
If not, we've got 2 minutes left, and I thought we'd just sort of a last sort of closing question. We'll obviously all be meeting back here again next year. I'm just interested from my panelists as to what would you like to see by this time next year in the hydrogen space. Perhaps we start with Katie.
Yeah, I mean, certainly significant progress with the projects that have been shortlisted and taken forward at the moment, getting spades in the ground. That'd be really exciting within next year and next couple of years. I think, as I mentioned earlier, having our production roadmap out to 2030 published would be really exciting, as well as our strategic approach to transport and storage planning. I think that both of those things at the end of this year is a sort of really comprehensive roadmap of how we move forward to meet our targets. And I think the launch of the second hydrogen allocation round is really exciting, gets us up to our 1 gigawatts of green. And we've got other things coming forward around track 1 expansion, and looking ahead to the EOI for track 2 for CCUS, all of which supports the hydrogen economy. So lots happening over the course of the next year.
Amazing, thanks Katie.
So what would I like to see? So my shopping list would be, I'd like to see nuclear-backed hydrogen, treated in the same way as renewables. Absolutely. I'd like to see some simplification around policy, consistency, particularly around the low carbon hydrogen standard. I'd like to see the additionality rules perhaps relaxed, and I would like to see a continuation really, and a continued commitment to funding of early stage projects and development, and if I could wish for anything, I'd also like to see the hydrogen business model above 5 megawatt limit reduced in some or all the cases to allow really innovative demonstration projects to get off the ground, in a viable way.
Brilliant. We had a question on that, so that's great to hear. And finally, Simon.
So I'd like to see more certainty from both a carrot and a stick point of view on providing the certainty on future pricing and demand for hydrogen. So the hydrogen bill being passed, be that through levies, contract for difference, and a clearer, progressive carbon taxation policy going forward as well. I'd like to see delivery of some of the pilots that are now in train. That would be great, and using that, coming back to the educating the public question, so shouting louder around where hydrogen's been used for a long time, but the more recent pilot activities as well, to educate and get more support from the public around the use of hydrogen in the future.
Brilliant, amazing. Well, that's all we've got time for, so if you'd like to join me in thanking our panellists today.